Welcome to The Word Revealed with David Palmer and Scott Burns, where we talk about everything Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Let's join the conversation.
Welcome back to The Word Revealed. I'm David Palmer with my fellow lover of Christ, His Word, and the evidence for Christ outside the New Testament, Pastor Scott Burns. How are you doing, Scott?
I am still doing better than I deserve,
That's
David.
Good. So we ended last time, we're talking about Josephus.
Yeah.
And we have this pretty weighty, significant paragraph in Antiquities, book 18. So,
yeah, it has a real Christian, almost creedal sound to it.
Right.
And yet you say that it's pretty controversial. So let's dig into that.
The controversy is some people, on exactly what you just said, some people feel like, wow, this is like too good to be true. This sounds like Josephus is a creedal, believing Christian, which would be the only evidence for that. If that were true, would be this, if that's what this paragraph means. Some scholars think that can't be. So how did it get into the manuscripts? Some people make an act. I just would call it, for how I see it, is an act of desperation to say, well, this must have been inserted into the manuscripts by Christian scribes. So the problem with that, there's two big problems with that theory. It seems to solve the issue, but it doesn't, because this material is in all of the manuscripts that we have of Josephus. So there's no evidence that there are variations in the manuscript tradition. The second
which would
thing,
point to it being original.
Yeah, right. Otherwise, if it's an interpolation, or if Christian scribes have messed with it, you would see variation in the manuscript families. You wouldn't see all the manuscripts the same.
Yeah.
So the truth is there's no evidence in the manuscript tradition for tampering with it. The second thing is, we mentioned in the previous episode that Josephus's works, also the works of Philo of Alexandria, which are massive amounts of material. Those works, 30 volumes for Josephus, a comparable volume of material from Philo, were transmitted by Christians, and we don't see evidence of Christian tampering with Philo. And I mean, when Philo starts talking about the Logos, and if Christian scribes were in the habit of making connections to Jesus in this material, then we would see that. And we don't. Those are two initial observations why we should approach the passage with thinking this is the voice of Josephus. But then we have to ask, well, what did Josephus mean, and how might we read this? So, is this a creedal confession, or is it just more of a neutral, slightly skeptical reporting of a devout Jew who's not committed himself to Jesus personally, but is aware of Jesus and the continuing existence of Christianity? And I think in the end of the day that's what we see here. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, let's dig into it.
So
take us through it.
Yeah, so the first line begins with it's a historic present. The most translations say now, about this time, and it came about. And it's a simple observation, but this type of terminology is the use of a historic present that is typical of Josephus and his style in this section. It's kind of unusual to use the historical present, but he uses it. So right out of the gate, the first word is unusual in its use, but it's typical of Josephus.
Okay.
Right out of the gate. Same with the time reference. He says that Jesus, the first thing he says about Jesus is he was a wise man. If I say, you have a gift of wisdom, and I tell people about you, Scott Burns has a gift of wisdom. But if I said Scott Burns is a wise guy,
that wouldn't be complimentary.
What would that mean?
It would mean that I'm like a smart aleck.
Okay, or at least it would at least raise the question. So, a sophos is the term that's used here. That Jesus is a wise man. It is to be a sophist in the first century means that you're someone who talks beyond what you actually are.
I've met those types.
Okay, so I just want to point out that it's not necessarily this huge complimentary word. It's a word that Josephus uses also in his works to describe people who have like extraordinary powers so it's not necessarily this. It may be more neutral or even less. The next line, and we read this in English translation, and it says, if it be permitted or lawful to call him a man. That sounds, it could be taken confessionally, but it's really not necessarily, because the first word in this phrase introduces a note of skepticism. It's fronted as, if it really be that way to call him a man. I think he's aware of the fact in his lifetime, his knowledge of early Christians. He's aware, just like Pliny said to Trajan, Christians gather and they sing hymns to Christ as to God. Josephus is kind of hedging and also, I would say, obliquely testifying to the fact that he knows Christians are calling him more than a man, and I think that he's just indicating that. What he does say next about Jesus is that he was a worker, literally, of paradoxical deeds. So you've preached a lot, you've taught a lot on the Gospels. Have you ever described the ministry of Jesus as this is Jesus, the worker of paradoxical deeds?
I've never described him that way.
Why not?
I think that would insert questions.
Right.
Those are like opposites, right? So.
Right. A paradox is like something that is not quite as it seems.
Yeah.
So, again, this is not necessarily a confessional statement. It's just commenting on Jesus did things that were kind of unusual, and that's what he says. So I just think you have to let him say what he's actually saying, with listening attentively. I would never have said it that way either. So we're both committed Christians, and yet that's not how we would describe Jesus's ministry. But that's how Josephus describes it. That he did some kind of fantastical things, deeds, startling.
So we're a couple lines into this, and what you're saying is a Christian could read this, and because of their faith, they're hearing this positively.
Right.
But Josephus isn't automatically saying positive things. He could be saying things that are less than positive, or at least skeptical.
Neutral, skeptical. I don't think it's hostile. I think it's, and this is what Josephus, in his very beginning of the Jewish War, he says, look, Greek historians are heavily biased, and he's like, I'm going to just try to be objective. And I think he's reporting this.
Okay.
I think he's, what we know of him, Josephus, he spends the last decades of his life really as an apologist for Judaism, he's proud of his heritage, the deep antiquity of his people. He knows they are slandered, and that's his goal in Antiquities, and he's covering this vast stretch of history, and he's locating Jesus' ministry during the time of Pilate. But we'll get to that. So what he does say, though, and this is interesting, he says that he was a teacher. That's really that's his confession of Jesus. He was a teacher. So if someone says to me, who was Jesus Christ? And they just say he was a great teacher. That's a little below what you would want to hear.
Yeah.
And Josephus says he was a teacher, and he was a teacher of a certain kind of people. He was a teacher of a type of people, and a very literal translation of the Greek text here. He was a didaskalos, a teacher, anthropon, of men, ton, that is the men, ton heronei taletheia dakomenon, that they are the kind of men who receive true things with pleasure, and they are led to in their reception of what they perceive as true by their sense of pleasure. So that is not a complimentary word, expression. If Paul says, in his letters, like, people receive like what their itching ears want.
Yeah.
Right? It like scratch my ears like a golden retriever, feels good. That's not saying someone's discerning. And Josephus uses this word pleasure several times again in his work, and it's not complimentary. So he might be saying something more like he was a teacher, but the kind of people who received his teaching were people who were gullible or kind of easily led by their senses, their sight, sound. And I think he was familiar with some of the deeds of Jesus feeding large groups of people, turning water into wine. So I think he's distancing himself from that.
Okay.
And then he says he drew over, which is language of conversion. He drew over many Judeans and many of the Greek element in society, which is another way of saying, many Judeans kind of went for this, and also like the foreign element in society went for it. And then we come to the line where he says the Christ, literally this one was. And some people, you drop into Josephus, you've never read him before, and you're like, wow, this guy just says Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ. But notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say anything about what that might mean. He just says Christ to an audience who doesn't have the theological associations of what that word might mean. He doesn't interpret it. The gospel writers, when they introduce the category of Messiah, they explain it. They say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in Mark. So in one sense, Mark's immediately glossing what Messiah means or Christ means by saying he's the real Son of God. Or John introduces this term and then translates it immediately. And Christos in Greek just has this generic meaning of anointed. Josephus does use this word elsewhere in a non-messianic sense to describe the plastering of a wall. So just like I mentioned earlier, many people in the Greco-Roman world have a nickname. In Book 20, he just calls Jesus the one who was called Christ, but he doesn't explain it. So he's differentiating him from the other Jesuses around. So it doesn't necessarily mean this is like how we would imagine in a church service when someone says, he is the Christ.
All right.
So maybe we don't need to over-interpret that.
Okay.
And on that point, it's a pretty consistent testimony of early Christian writers who cite Josephus that he, in fact, is not a Christian. So they cite him as evidence for Jesus, locating the time of Jesus' ministry. But just like no one says Tacitus became a Christian because he mentioned those things. Even though Tacitus, remember, says the way Christians died actually moved people to compassion. So maybe he moved from hostile to a seeker. So he says a little bit more about Jesus that's, again, in line with the Gospels. I want to point out the order of the text in paragraph 64. It starts with drawing your attention to Jesus, like what happens to him. It starts off with, and him, that is Jesus, at the prompting or at the instigation or at the decision or recommendation of the principal men, the first men among us. So he's signaling that the leading members of the Judean society, of which he sees himself as part, their recommendation to Pilate was that he be impaled. And that's what he says, that at the recommendation of the first men among us to a cross, Pilate, had him impaled. So, this is striking, and for us, the cross of Christ is such a positive image. But we have to remember that Cicero says it's beneath the dignity of a Roman to even use the word. Josephus calls it the most wretched way to die. To signal he was crucified, and the responsibility there is split between the leading members of Judea, and ultimately it's Pilate's decision because crucifixion is a Roman decision. So here's indirect testimony that Jesus is crucified, that he really died. Then he says that the ones who loved him at first, that is before his death, that they didn't stop. They didn't stop loving him. And then we have these two lines of, and again, I think we need to just hear this as Josephus reporting what Christians are saying, that he appeared to them. And the expression he uses is a little unusual. He says, literally, he appeared to them having a third day, again, alive. So that's what he heard. It's a little bit of an awkward way to express that. You and I would say, like with the Gospels, like on the third day he rose. And Josephus says, again, just a little like reported speech. They say he appeared to them having at least a third day alive. So he doesn't mention anything beyond that. He doesn't mention any of the other resurrection appearances. He doesn't mention any of the ministry or instruction of Jesus to the disciples. He just says that they say he appeared to them. And then he says, of the divine prophets, these things and literally myriads, which is 10,000. So he says, these things and a few 10,000s of other extraordinary things they say about him. So that sounds like this is a guy who knows the Bible. He's just paraphrased the Bible in 16 volumes, and he reports that Christians say that there are 10,000s upon 10,000s of words about Jesus. So, again, is that a confessional statement, or does that sound like a little bit of exaggeration? To me, what I hear in that is exactly what we heard last episode, where Suetonius says that Claudius expelled the Jewish community from Rome because they had all these disturbances about the identity of the Messiah. It sounds exactly to me like when Paul is in Corinth and he appears before Gallio, and Gallio tries to decide the case, and he says, look, you guys are just arguing about names and terms in your own books. Like, what do you want me to say? This sounds like Josephus saying the same. Like, oh, the Christians say there's 10,000 passages. I mean, not even the most zealous preacher or New Testament scholar that I know would say there are at least 20,000 prophecies. Right? That seems like a big number. So, is it skeptical? I don't know. Is it just reported speech? I don't think it has to be taken as confessional. And the last line, I think, confirms this, because the last line of the paragraph says he calls Christians the tribe. So, would you ever describe the church as a tribe?
No.
Why not? Why wouldn't you?
I don't know. I just wouldn't. I just wouldn't describe it that way. I can't come up with a reason why in this moment, but
it's not a New Testament image.
No, it's definitely not a New Testament image,
and it's somewhere below the level of nation.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a subtle way of just saying this is like a sect group or it's a tribe. But he does say that even until now, this tribe of the Christians, of the Christians, and this is the only explanation he gives to the readership of the Antiquities about what the name Christ means. He says that the tribe of the Christians is named for this guy Christ. That's all he says. You know, we read in Acts that the name Christian is given to the believing community by the citizens of Antioch, that they do share faith in Christ, but it's not necessarily a full faith committal. So it's an important passage. I don't think that we have to approach it with undue skepticism on the one hand, or an undue optimism like, lo and behold, Josephus is now a Christian. If he were a Christian, he would have said more.
Yeah.
And, you know, the guy writes 30 volumes, and he mentions Jesus in one line and then one paragraph. So that in and of itself. We don't see evidence of Christian tampering with the text, but what do we have? I think we have a learned, devout Jew who's aware of Jesus and the facts of his ministry, his death under Pilate by crucifixion, and the report of early Christians that he was alive, and they are still gathering in a recognizable group that's a mixture of Jews and foreigners together in this tribe that he calls the Christians.
And if we understand it that way, then what we've got is a number of facts about the early story of Christ,
right,
coming from someone who's not necessarily sympathetic,
right?
So an outside witness.
And in that sense, it's like what we had from the Roman writers, in that sense of attesting to the evidence existence of Jesus, the evidence of the early church outside the New Testament. You know, what happens to Tacitus at the end of his life, we don't know. What happens to Josephus ultimately, we don't know. I would hope that the people listening to this podcast, if they're committed believers, would have greater confidence that we know Jesus existed historically, and that the basic facts of the New Testament are attested by writers outside the New Testament. You should be confident of that. And if you're listening to the podcast and you aren't sure what to make of Jesus yet, you are like Tacitus. And maybe just hearing the story, maybe I hope some of this conversation just removes unnecessary doubts, and that the best place to go to actually learn about Jesus and what he taught is the Gospels themselves.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk about that in a next episode, about evidence that we have of what happens when pagans start actually reading the New Testament documents, and the earliest evidence we have of that. So that'll be a fun conversation maybe for another time.
Yeah.
Well, good conversation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that, David.
So
it's good stuff.
It is. It's really fascinating. And again, the language is genuine to Josephus. And I've heard people make what I would say is another sort of act of desperation. People have said, well, could this be just a forgery of someone who... And I think, again, at that point, you're grasping at straws to account for this. And we have, in our moment in history, we have, all the texts of Josephus in computer systems that can easily search with a concordance, and the language that's here really matches Josephus. And someone in antiquity wouldn't be easily able to do that. And so the language is there, but not necessarily confessional. But attesting Jesus' existence and the main events of the Gospels. And so that piece of skepticism should be removed, and we should go to the Gospels themselves. So
these last couple episodes have been a little bit different, but what we're trying to help people understand is that as you're reading the Bible, there are people that aren't contributing to the Bible that are still saying similar things, and gives you confidence that what you're reading in the Bible is historically accurate.
Right, and real. And again, there's a lot at stake for us on that point. So, well, thank you, everyone, for joining us on The Word Revealed. We're excited for you to enjoy these episodes. Please give us a like and share this episode with others. We've been really grateful to see the exponential growth of our listeners across many different countries, and thank you for joining us on The Word Revealed. We look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Good to be with everybody.
Thank you for joining Dr. David Palmer, Senior Pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church in Cincinnati, and Scott Burns, Associate Pastor. Meet us here next time for another conversation on the Bible.